Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the session titled Insights from the Boston Postdoctoral Association Survey. So my name is Isha Verma, and I'm a volunteer with NPA. I'm from the University of Michigan, and today I'm going to be serving as a moderator for this session. So as a reminder, the attendees are only in the listen-only mode, where the camera and the mics are off. So you can use the chat function on the screen on the right side, and the chat function is intended for general discussion around the topic. And if you have a question for the presenter, please drop it in the Q&A session by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and the presenter will address this question at the end of the presentation. And just as a reminder, all of these sessions are recorded and they will be available for viewing next week. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce you to all to the speaker for the session, that is Insights from the Boston Postdoctoral Survey, is Ian Mahar. So Ian is a president of the Boston Postdoctoral Association and the longest-standing advocate for academic trainees. He's also a postdoctoral researcher in the neurology department of Boston University and the Boston University Alzheimer's Disease and Chronic Traumatic Encephalopathy Center. And his doctorate was in neuroscience at McGill University in Montreal. And his research focuses on the neurobiology of psychiatric issues, primarily in human postmortem sample, focusing on the context of neurodegenerative disease and hippocampal neuroplasticity. So I'll turn it over to the presenter now, and please join us during the Q&A. Ian, you can go ahead, please.
Thanks, Isha. I really appreciate the introduction. As Isha said, my name is Ian Mahar, and I am the president of the Boston Postdoctoral Association, and also a postdoc in neurology at Boston University. And it's the former role that I wanted to address you all today. And I wanted to firstly thank the NPA for giving us a chance to talk to you all. And I'm very excited to be able to share some of our latest information. So my plan is to talk a little bit about the Boston Postdoctoral Association as a whole and some of our initiatives and advocacy planning and the tools we use to guide our advocacy efforts. And I'll be doing that by mostly talking about a postdoc survey that we launched in the Boston University, in the Boston region back in 2019. And some of the interesting findings that have come out for that, but also how that might be related to postdocs in general. And I'll also be trying to interpret some of this data and describing where we're going in our next steps. But firstly, just to introduce the Boston Postdoctoral Association a little bit, we are a 501c6 nonprofit organization in the Boston area. It's among the largest regional postdoctoral associations. We've got a population typically between 8,000 to 10,000 postdocs. It varies by year, and it's entirely made up of volunteers that represent over 8,000 postdocs. And we operate through connections with postdoctoral members and largely postdoctoral associations, postdoctoral offices, and institutes in the area. I just saw that Chris dropped a link to our website in the chat, so you can check that out there. And I'll have plenty of contact info at the end. So I won't go through the whole list here, but as I said, we rely heavily on our connections to the PDAs in particular, even though we operate independently. And this is a list of 19 PDAs in the Boston area that we've interacted with in the past, and hopefully in the future we'll see even more. But the Boston area has a very large population of postdocs, and it's obviously spread amongst a very large number of institutes. Our activities are kind of split in a number of different functions, and I think the easiest way to parse it is by our main committees. So our main committees are career development, communications, social activities, and advocacy. And advocacy may be the most important and is definitely the most relevant to my talk today. The idea is we try to take in information from postdocs and respond to issues affecting postdocs. So we wanted to create the largest and most comprehensive surveys of postdoctoral and attitudes in issues focused on this population in order to guide future advocacy efforts for us and others in the future. the broad goal of this was to find issues that are affecting postdoctoral well-being, particularly in our population in Boston postdocs. And that would allow us to direct our future advocacy efforts. But we wanted to make an especially broad assessment. This would cover topics of finances, mentorship, future career, and overall well-being. So the idea was we wanted to focus as broadly as possible, and chose to take a longer, larger survey over a smaller one that might have gotten more responses, but might have been less shallow in granularity. We wanted to find the issues that were relevant for our region, but we also wanted to identify issues that affect postdocs in general. And I'll talk about this more in the end, but I think that it's especially important to study postdocs in a regional manner because there are certain things that are potentially particular to certain regions, and certain regions might have more acute needs and others in certain domains. But I think the point that comes across from these data is actually that the issues affecting Boston postdocs are especially acute. They're acute in Boston, but they're applicable to postdocs across the U.S. and perhaps even broader. So I think that the importance of these data actually goes well beyond the Boston area. And within that, we also wanted to look at postdocs that are in particular populations that have individual needs that we need to assess. For example, international postdocs or postdoc parents. And I think you'll see that there are some really particular findings that are relevant to those groups and others. And we did this through an online survey that we disseminated across Boston area institutions. And I'll tell you a little bit about the methods of that. Basically, we recruited through the local PDAs and PDOs, as well as our own newsletter, and asked Boston area postdocs to fill out a survey on SurveyMonkey. It had 85 questions. It was open from May to July in 2019, so it's a relatively specific snapshot of what is happening in the Boston area at that time. And as I mentioned earlier, we try to be as broad as possible with the questions, demographic questions, financial, job-related, mentorship, career, and some general stress and well-being questions. So in the end, we ended up getting responses from 628 Boston area postdocs. One thing I want to stress is that this is unpublished, and we're still doing some of the analyses. So this is somewhat preliminary, but in terms of the summary data, this is where we're at this point. And we ended up getting data from 25 affiliations across the Boston region. And I won't go through these in detail, but just to give you something of an idea of where the largest numbers of responses came from. This is roughly an order of the density of respondents. So we got the Harvard University had the most responses, and then BIDMC, Beth Israel, MIT, Boston University. So unsurprisingly, it kind of followed the trend where the largest institutes had the most representation. I'm not going to go into too much depth about the demographics of the study. I do have that in some bonus slides if people have particular questions, but we haven't done a lot of the individual stratification by different demographics. So, and we also have a lot of slides to try to get through. So I'm not going to cover this too much unless someone has a particular question, but feel free to ask me more specific demographic questions in the Q&A. The respondents were mostly from STEM faculties, which reflects the fact that most postdocs are in these faculties. 92% and 10%, 92% had a PhD and 10% had an MD. We didn't add a question for people that had both, but that would probably be good to add in a future version. Is roughly equivalent between male and female postdocs. The average was about a little less than 2 years in their current postdoc, and 30% had done a previous postdoc before this one. And the first thing I want to highlight is the proportion that were U.S. citizens. It was only 1/3 that were U.S. citizens. So 2/3 were immigrant postdocs, 62% on a temporary visa, and 5% permanent resident. So it's very important to stress just the size of the population that is international, especially when it comes to visa issues, as we'll talk about in right now. The the importance of having so many of the postdocs as internationals is really acute when you ask about the issues that are affecting international postdocs in particular. So as you see from this slide, there of the respondents that are on temporary visas, 88% said their visa status affected their future career opportunities. 82% of those were moderately to extremely. And of those respondents on temporary visas, 86% said that this influenced their decision to stay in the US, with 80% indicating this moderately to extremely. And 86% said that their visa considerations were a source of distress, so a very large proportion. 36% of these to an extreme degree, which I think is really important to focus on. Just the degree that are not just affected, but affected to an extreme degree about uncertainty with their visa status. I think that when you look at the issue of funding in particular, this is really acute, where again, 40% of these respondents at the bottom weren't foreign postdocs, but for the rest, 59% said their status substantially limited their ability to apply for funding. 30% thought it was limited. So 89% of foreign postdocs felt that their foreign status limited their ability to apply for or obtain funding, which is important because that also relates to the financial situation in general. Unsurprisingly, the majority of postdocs receive their compensation from their institute. So generally that would be funding from their PI, for example, in R01. And there were 7% each that were funded by a foundation or by a postdoctoral fellowship, a training grant like an F32. But I think what we really need to highlight is the financial situation of postdocs individually in terms of their personal finances. So what we found for salary is that the average salary for postdoctoral for postdocs in Boston from our survey was $51,802 as a mean and $50,070 as the median. And keep in mind, this is in 2019. The NIH entry stipend guideline at that point was $50,004. And actually 45% of our population made less than the NIH entry stipend. And that is the first level of being a postdoc, not taking into consideration the suggested increases over year by year. And actually 56% of the population made $51,000 or less. And 90% of postdocs made less than $60,000. With only 5% making over $80,000. So you can see that the range of salaries is extremely narrow, and it clusters very, very closely along the NIH suggested stipend, but only the entry point for the stipend. In contrast, the average salary for Boston is $77,000, or actually it's slightly larger than that now. This was in 2019. So more than 98% of postdocs. So the average U.S. worker, again, not focusing on Boston in particular, with a bachelor's or higher, earned $71,864, or 39% more than postdocs on average. So there is a pretty large disparity, but it's especially acute in Boston, where more than 98% of postdocs were making less than the average Boston salary. And that also is relative to extremely high costs. I think it's important to point out that the average housing costs that postdocs were paying was $1,463 a month. That is, $17,556 a year, or roughly 34% of the average salary. And there, I'm actually using the mean rather than the median, and the mean is higher. And this is the pre-tax salary, 34%. So according to the USDA, the average postdoc in Boston is actually in a status known as housing stress. And according to HUD, 10 to 12% of Boston postdocs are actually severely cost burdened. We found that 3% were using university housing, and overall less than 1% owned a home on their own, and 7% with a partner, and 81% rented, and that includes 62% that were of the overall group that were renting with roommates. And in terms of the other job-related questions that factor into how we consider these financial findings. The average weekly hours that postdocs were working was 56 hours. And if you translate that into per hour earnings, 40% made less than $5 above the minimum wage for Massachusetts. 7% of postdocs were actually making less than minimum wage. In terms of the paid days off, the average number of paid days off was 11 per year across all postdocs. But 14% actually took 0 days off as their paid days off in the last year. We found that 96% of postdocs were working on weekends, at least occasionally, and 54% worked at least most weekends. So 56% worked most weekends or more. In terms of income attitudes, unsurprisingly, when we asked if postdocs thought that the salary was sufficient to cover their expenses, 28% agreed, only 5% strongly, and 59% disagreed. So the almost 60% of postdocs disagree that their salary is sufficient to cover their expenses, and this is actually a fairly large stressor for postdocs. So basically, the current salary was negatively affecting the quality of life for 93% of respondents, 70% moderately to extremely, and it is a sense of stress for almost all postdocs in the region. Less than 10% said it wasn't a source of stress. So it is, that's 93% found it to be a source of stress, and 85% found that it was negatively affecting their quality of life. So for 93 and 85% respectively, it was having a negative impact on them. And those earlier estimates I said earlier were actually not including utilities. So we asked about utilities as well to get a better picture of the sort of postdoctoral budget. And adding in utilities, phone and transportation, student loan payments, we ended up with an amount of about $23,200 on average. And that would be 45% of the total salary on average. But that's not taking into consideration taxes. And in addition, for those folks that did pay for childcare, if they paid for childcare as postdoc parents, they were paying on average $22,561. So someone in this circumstance would be paying almost $46,000 against a salary of $51,800. And again, this is not including groceries. For international postdocs, it's not including flights home and for visas and visits and things like that. So it is a relatively tight budget relative to the salary. And that brings up the issue of postdoc parents in particular, because they are a population in which we suspected there were a lot of really acute needs given the extra strain and costs. We found that 18% of our population were parents. 84% did not receive a child care subsidy, either from their institute or elsewhere. And when they did receive a subsidy, the average subsidy was $449, which is less than about a third of their average childcare costs. When we asked what would improve the well-being of as a Boston postdoc parent, 90% said institutional subsidies or reimbursements for childcare. 30% said networking with other postdoc parents for shared childcare. And in terms of non-financial benefits, what would be helpful is for 30% was additional understanding from the supervisor and mentor, and 26% social interaction with other postdoc parents in the Boston area, which I think is especially important because I'd like to highlight interventions that aren't necessarily as expensive systemically in terms of things that we could make progress on without making systemic financial changes, which I also think are necessary. So I think it's difficult to sort of parse all of this information unless you sort of put it together in a sort of summary that people can relate to. So I think it makes the most sense to sort of parse it as taking into consideration what the job and compensation is as a job description. So basically, a hypothetical job description for a postdoc in the Boston area would be someone that works for 56 hours per week, working frequent weekends with taking less than 2 weeks off, often for less than $5 above minimum wage, under a housing stress status on average due to housing payments that are averaging almost $1,500 a month, which is probably split. This is after splitting with roommates. The basic expenses without groceries averaged 45% of the salary, but as I want to make very clear, that's pre-taxes. And the Boston postdoc parents, if they were in this situation, would additionally have childcare costs of over 17 grand a year, and only 12% would receive childcare subsidies from their institutes, averaging $449 a month. And the entry requirements for this position would be a doctoral degree at the entry level. So I think that helps to sort of parse exactly what the relationship is between the nature of the work put in and the compensation as a result, particularly for Boston postdocs. But as I'll get into, I think this generalizes to lots of other places that postdocs are working. In addition to the financial side, it's extremely important, obviously, to look at other aspects of postdoctoral experiences, particularly training, which is one of the primary reasons people go into a postdoc. We looked at the particulars of their academic jobs and mentorship beyond their compensation hours and job logistics to look at how postdocs feel about their academic positions in particular. In terms of mentorship, it was actually postdocs were relatively satisfied with their mentorship on the whole. 2/3 of postdocs were satisfied or very satisfied. Only 17% were dissatisfied or very dissatisfied, which tells me that postdocs on average are fairly satisfied with their postdoctoral interactions. And the number of meetings was actually the frequency of meetings was actually surprising to me, in the sense that 75% met at least biweekly, which I think is very positive. 90% met at least monthly. I think that's a great figure. Only 42% received an annual assessment, but in my mind, I think that the frequency of meetings makes that less of a huge concern. So that is a positive aspect of our findings, I think. However, we also wanted to look for the presence of hostile work environments or situations of abuse in mentorship. In terms of our findings with those, the most commonly reported were unreasonable performance expectations, supervisory neglect, verbal abuse, and breaches of academic ethics. This was things like manuscript authorship issues. The least common, but still present, were instances of physical abuse, sexual misconduct, or breaches of scientific ethics, for example, data fabrication. So those were all present, but in terms of frequency, these were the least common. Now, in terms of mentor demographics, some of this actually recapitulates the findings of a 2016 National Postdoc Survey, which I didn't realize until after doing these analyses, but it really is similar. 74% of the mentors of the postdocs that we surveyed were male, so it's very skewed in terms of the mentor demographics. 51% had a mentor of the same gender. However, that's also extremely skewed when you split that by the gender of the postdocs. 28% had a female. 28% of female postdocs had a mentor of the same gender, whereas 76% of male postdocs had a mentor of the same gender. And this is actually very stark at the PI level. So 17% of assistant profs, 70% of the profs in general that were supervising postdocs were assistant, 24 associate, and 53 full. But at the assistant level, it was 63% male, and at the full professor level, the PI supervising postdocs were 82% male. And I think this is a very striking gender inequity at the higher levels in particular. And I was told, I was talking to Gary McDowell, formerly from Future of Research now with Lightoller, and I think everyone should check out his work, about a paper from PNAS from Jason Scheltzer that suggested that elite male-led labs hired fewer women. So that is actually exacerbating this problem, having this skew at the higher levels. In terms of how appreciated postdocs felt in their position, it was about a 6 out of 10, which is fairly moderate. When we asked them in an open forum question, what would make you feel more appreciated, 40% mentioned salary or compensation, so it was fairly consistent, relative to 18% that mentioned mentorship or associated issues, and 4% mentioned receiving feedback. But the largest by far was salary or compensation. What I found to be especially interesting is that we found, in terms of input, there's an interesting hint at something analogous to an imposter syndrome at the postdoctoral level, where 39% of postdocs thought they were publishing below the level of their peers, and only 9% thought that they were publishing above the level of their peers, suggesting that potentially other success is being overrepresented in the perceptions of postdocs. It's possible that the folks that are publishing above the level of their peers are just not spending their time taking surveys, but I think it's more likely that there's something analogous to imposter syndrome in terms of publishing output and evaluating themselves relative to other postdocs. I also thought it was interesting that there was a disconnect in terms of teaching. So 69% of our postdocs said they would like to include teaching with their postdoctoral experience, but the proportion that was able to teach or that felt they had sufficient opportunities to teach was was that ratio flipped. So basically, the 66% said that they had not had sufficient opportunities to teach. So basically, there's a sort of a disconnect between the numbers of postdocs that would like to be able to teach and those that were able to give to get an opportunity to teach. This slide is a bit messy, just to make sure that we can cover it in case anyone has questions. But the general gist is, for career choices of postdocs, the most appealing job options were still research, either in academia or industry, although industry was a close second. What I'd like to do in the future is see exactly how that changes over time, to see if the number of years of postdocs affects their subsequent career choices. And in terms of the factors that they felt might reduce the likelihood of finding their ideal career path, that is the choices that they wanted to pursue as a top priority, these were mostly obstacles of an overly competitive market, a lack of publications, geographical considerations, visa or immigration issues, or a lack of confidence. But what I want to emphasize here is that this is across all postdocs, not just postdocs that are international. So that we should weight the visa or immigration issues even more highly with that in consideration. So it seems like visa and immigration issues are very important for postdocs as a whole. And we also assess well-being in our population, as this is something that I think is especially important, not just as my background is sort of as a psychiatric researcher, but as someone that I think this is something that we're starting to recognize from investigations is potentially an issue for postdocs. So we found that the current level of stress for postdocs out of 10, they rated it as a 7. For context, this is higher than the 4.9 average from the American Psychological Association's 2019 Stress in America survey, which asked a similar question. And they also said that their perceived healthy stress, this is the average American, perceived healthy stress at a 3.9, whereas postdocs were about a 7. Life satisfaction was rated at below 6 at 5.7. This is also less than the US average of 6.9 and the OECD average of 6.5. When we look at the overall satisfaction of postdocs with their postdoctoral experience, we find that a bit over half were satisfied overall, so moderately satisfied with their overall experience, and about the same proportion felt hopeful about their current postdoc and their career in general. So it wasn't predominantly negative. It was the most common would be slightly above neutral, and on average, more than half were satisfied and felt hopeful. But we also found that they describe negative impacts of their postdoc on their mental health. 40% negative versus 26% positive. The most positive factors for postdoc success or well-being, when we dug a little deeper, were mentorship, salary, job availability, benefits, Boston housing, and interaction with other postdocs. All of these were indicated by more than half of respondents as being important to their success or well-being. Again, it's important to point out that visa or immigration issues, this is the number across all respondents, and a third of those would be Americans that are not would not have visa or citizenship or immigration concerns, presumably. So that just goes to show how prominent that issue is for international postdocs in particular. And when we asked in an open forum question, what would have the most positive impact in improving your well-being as a Boston postdoc, it was actually really striking how consistent the responses were, in that more than 50% mentioned compensation or housing costs. And this is relative to 12% that mentioned mentorship, which was still comparatively common. I mean, as an open forum response, the answers were pretty broad, but mentorship is incredibly important to postdocs, and more than 4 times the number of respondents mentioned compensation or housing costs in particular when we asked what would increase their well-being. One thing that I thought was interesting, especially because a lot of the issues we're talking about are incredibly expensive to fix, I also wanted to focus on some issues that would be slightly less expensive to fix and more addressable, for example, for PDOs that have a limited budget or ability to influence things like compensation. We asked if having the institute allow you to keep their institutional email address would how much it would benefit them in order to be able to keep their email address. And it was interesting because 80% of postdocs said it would help them. 51% actually said it would greatly help them, which is worth pointing out as it's comparatively inexpensive. And it's also important from an academic sense because a lot of postdocs are listed as corresponding authors on publications, and their institutional email is listed as this correspondence email. But it seems like this is something that would be comparatively less expensive than a lot of issues we're talking about to address that would also improve postdoc well-being. And then finally, we looked at national level postdoc related issues. And I think that is important, not just for us as a regional group to look nationally, but also for groups like the NPA to pay attention to, and also for us to focus not just on what we thought as a population regionally, but that we think are endemic issues. And the most prominent national level postdoc related policies were salary. I mean, 94% said that salary was an important national level issue, unsurprisingly, given some of the previous responses. And immigration and visa policies at 68%. And again, that is actually slightly more than the proportion of the sample that was international. So that it really is striking just how important that is to postdocs, particularly internationals. Because this slide is including even those respondents that were US citizens. So in terms of trying to figure out what the overall situation is for Boston area postdocs, it's difficult to concisely summarize the broad findings of 85 questions. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more in the next few slides, but I think that if we're going to try to summarize it, I think we would say that there are some moderately positive findings for satisfaction with mentorships and postdoctoral experience and future hopefulness. I do think it's important to point out that in terms of well-being, Boston postdocs are more stressed than satisfied in their postdoctoral lives currently. And there's some indication of negative influence on mental health. And most importantly, I think there are clear financial focal points of salary and cost of living, with immigrant and postdoc parents facing additional stressors that I think merit attention. Is this worse during or after COVID-19? We don't know, because these data are pre-COVID. I am unsure if these issues would be worsened. I don't expect they've gotten better since the onset of the pandemic, but I think it'll be important to look in subsequent years as well. I think it's important at a national level to discuss whether other cities are similar to Boston and whether these results extrapolate to postdocs across the USA. So some things are specific to Boston. I mean, among the cities in Boston, it's one of the most expensive. And there's room to believe that maybe institutes in Boston might behave differently in terms of offering benefits or supporting mentorship than other cities. So it's important to look at a regional level. And I really feel it's important for individual regional PDAs to look at their own populations in a regional manner. But I think it's really important for postdocs outside of Boston to realize that these results likely extrapolate well to most postdocs in the city and in the country. And I think that's because most postdocs are in expensive coastal cities. I mean, if we look just very briefly at the breakdown, on the top, we say a ranking. I mean, this is specifically STEM postdocs, but it follows the general trends. The most dense postdoc populations are in California, Massachusetts, and New York, which are also extremely expensive. Postdocs are mostly in expensive cities like Boston. I stole this bottom slide from the 2016 national survey, and the bottom title is slightly misleading as the actual figure is showing adjusted income relative to cost of living, which is largely related to housing costs, but the general trend is the same. Postdocs are largely concentrated in places where their income is lower relative to the cost of living, and where the housing costs are extremely high, which presents acute pressure, as we found in our results. So I think there are a number of policy and advocacy implications that we need to focus on. And I think it's important to say it's fairly clear that salary relative to cost of living is far off the mark. And also, it's really striking that salaries very closely follow the NIH minimum. And I should point out that's not as a whole in terms of the NIH guidelines suggesting an increase in salary every year, which doesn't seem to be followed that closely from our data, but the entry level in particular. So it seems that postdocs are being paid relatively closely to that mark that's set by the NIH, and that there is very little deviation, but also that an increase to $60,000 would simultaneously be a raise for 84% of postdocs, but even that would still be $17,000 below the Boston average, and that's 2019 numbers. So it would require a large increase to even be $17,000 below. So it does seem that large increases in minimum salary guidelines are required. And not only that, we found that 45% were making less than that suggested minimum, which suggests that there should be more enforcement of at least making sure that the postdocs are making a livable wage, especially in expensive cities like Boston, but also in general. Housing was very frequently indicated as a concern, and it would be clear that institutional housing subsidies or access to low-cost housing would go really far to address a really common issue if institutions were able to add that to their benefits for postdocs. Mentorship was indicated as less of a concern. A lot of postdocs, the majority seemed satisfied, or at least slightly satisfied to greatly satisfied with their mentorship, but it's still identified prominently as an issue of concern for postdocs, and it's something that that needs to be focused on as a policy and advocacy situation, especially as we did identify a number of situations in which postdocs were in toxic or abusive environments. We also identified gender inequity in mentors, especially at higher levels of PI-ship. Is obviously important to continue to increase the proportion of female PIs, but this is especially important in the senior positions where we saw the greatest disparity. We also found that for postdoc parents in particular, there does seem an acute need for childcare subsidies and facilities. But we also noticed that a lot of postdoc parents expressed a desire for socializing and network networking opportunities with other postdoc parents. And that's something that we as PDAs can focus on. We can try to provide resources, even if it's just opening up a Slack channel for postdoc parents in your region to discuss with each other and socialize and network. I think that is another sort of low-cost option that we can look at as PDAs and PDOs. We identified that international postdocs felt particular vulnerability around their visas, which is not necessarily surprising, but I think it's something that it's very striking how consistently that was indicated as a prominent issue, especially as you consider that a third of our survey population was not international. We found that there's a mismatch for teaching opportunities for postdocs in that roughly 70% wanted to teach, but roughly 70% found that they were not getting sufficient teaching opportunities. And I think that is something that hopefully could be addressed at an institutional level. And a lot of the issues that I'm pointing out are, systemic issues that are extremely expensive to address, but just in terms of giving those of us at all levels of advocacy things to focus on that aren't necessarily so expensive. There are some interventions that we identified that individual institutes or PDAs could look at that wouldn't necessarily face as much resistance in terms of costs. So things like letting postdocs keep their institutional emails. From our data, that would benefit postdocs, or they feel it would benefit them. Encouraging more time off, addressing hostile work environments, as we noted that we found a range of issues of various prevalence, and also requiring postdoc mentoring as part of funding awards, given that mentoring was indicated as an issue of importance to postdocs. And I think that's something, in addition to the financial considerations, that institutions and funding agencies can prioritize, that would increase the well-being of postdocs, especially as such an important part of the training experience. In terms of the future directions of our data, we still want to do some sub-analyses by demographics, identify which factors contribute the most to well-being and stress. For example, are there particular considerations for housing issues, postdoc parents, funding or output that contribute most to well-being or stress, and also looking at data from other sources that ask similar questions. For example, we know Boston Children's Hospital has data with similar questions. It'd be interesting to merge them to have more focus across a broader population of postdocs, to have more data, to have a clearer view of what the issues are that we need to focus on. And finally, repeating across cohorts. I mean, we did this survey in 2019. I think it would be interesting to repeat it at regular intervals, but also compare pre and post-COVID to see what the acute effects of the pandemic would be, as well as to see which factors seem to change over time and which seem relatively fixed, and also to regularly address where we should focus our advocacy efforts. And I'd just like to thank the people that contributed to these efforts. Dr. Megan Pierce is the co-chair with myself on the advocacy committee, and contributed a lot. I'd like to thank the advocacy committee as a whole for really volunteering a lot of time to put this out. This was all a voluntary effort, just like the Boston Postdoc Association in general. Sarah Hokinson has always been a huge ally of ours, and we're really grateful. She's with the Boston University PDPA, that's Professional Development and Postdoctoral Affairs. And she also worked with us in terms of the IRB approval, and she's actually launching a postdoc academy for any postdocs that are interested, that folks should check out. That basically is sort of like an orientation and resources for postdocs. Dr. Gary McDowell, formerly a Future of Research, now with Lightoller. I would check him out. He is doing some really great work, and he had a lot of awesome insights into what we were looking at. The BPDA board members and the BPDA volunteers who spent so much of their time helping us out. I was supported completely independently of this from CHR and FRQS in Canada, and Boston University reviewed the IRB, and they've been really supportive the whole time. So I'm really grateful to them. I'm really grateful to the NPA for giving us a chance to talk about this. And possibly most important, This is something that we are looking at constantly in terms of doing advocacy work. You can send me an email anytime. That's my email and the association's email. We have a website at bostonpostdocs.org. We're actually looking to spruce it up, but we're looking to hopefully find someone that has some skills in that area. So if you know someone that is good at that, please give us a shout about that as well. But otherwise, please get in touch if you want to talk about issues with your PDA or ideas you have, or just to discuss advocacy. And thanks again for listening. And I'll take questions. I think we got 15 minutes or so. Isha, you're muted if you're talking now.
Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you, Jan, for the presentation. So I want to remind everyone, if you have any question, please drop it in the Q&A section so that Jan can answer them. So Jan, the first question is by Tracy. She's asking, how do you get the universities to pay more or consider location instead of just the NIH minimum salary?
I think that's a great question. It's also probably the most difficult to answer, but I think that there are some things that have now become fairly clear about where to address issues like that. First of all, considering location in terms of salary, I think that I'm sort of on the fence about whether we should be advocating adjusting for per capita income of region. I'm always unsure about whether postdocs in regions such as Texas, who have a lower housing cost than the other cities, would sort of balk at that or feel like it's unfair. But I think the majority of postdocs do live in high cost of living increases. So I think if that was accounted for, it would probably lead to a net increase in salary for postdocs. So I think it's definitely worth considering that. And I would be in favor of that, although I'm biased because I'm a postdoc in an expensive city. But I think more importantly, how do we get universities to pay more? What was very clear from our data is that the salaries were very closely clustered to the NIH minimum. It was basically very few were making substantially more than the minimum. I think it was 54% were making within $1,000 of the entry NIH minimum or less, and 45% are actually making less. So I think that, and actually, even if we went from 50,000 to 60,000, that would be more than 84% of postdocs are making. So it's very clear that it's clustered around the NIH minimum. So I think it's something that a discussion that needs to be made partially at the level of funding agencies in establishing minimums and enforcing them, and for institutions to ensure that postdocs are actually making the at least a minimum that is livable, especially in high cost of living cities. Hopefully that answers your question. To the Q&A format, it's difficult to have a discussion about it. Is a measure of the impact of union membership. So in Massachusetts, there is a union for the UMass schools for graduate students. But I do not believe that's the case for postdocs. And the majority of postdocs, if not all postdocs in the Boston region, would not be unionized. I think if you were going to, there are unions within the United States of postdocs, but it would be difficult to assess some of those because they would be in comparatively lower cost of living regions. I think it's difficult to say now, given the small number of postdocs in these expensive cities. But I think if you looked in California, for example, you could probably do a more direct comparison of unionized versus non-unionized postdocs. Yes, so there was a question about trans and gender nonconforming postdoc issues. So we had, I'm really interested in that. I think that it's something that is not discussed very often. The reason I didn't discuss it in this presentation is because when you look at the demographics that we actually found in our survey response, I think it is, I'm just going to pull this up if I can see it. It was less than 1% of the population said they were non-binary or trans. So we didn't feel like we had enough granularity in the data to make any generalizations. But I think if we had a sufficiently large sample, that would be an absolutely valid thing to look at. We just unfortunately didn't have the resolution to be able to talk about it.
Yeah, so the next question is by Yarazet. Like, can you please explain a bit more on what do you mean by requesting postdoc mentoring as a part of funding award?
Right. Certain training awards actually require that there is a section of the application that specifies the kind of training that the postdoc would receive. So basically, the training agent the funding agency is saying, if we give you this money, how do we know it's actually going to benefit the postdoc and not just going to be used to buy, antibodies or equipment or something? So they have to, at least on paper, say that the person on this training award will at least receive a certain type of mentorship. It's not often enforced by the agency, but at least there's some attention paid to a plan for the postdoc. But not, it's a minority of postdocs that are actually on those training awards. It could be something that is broadened to more funding awards and possibly even for non-training grants like an R01 to say, if you were going to pay a postdoc with this award, can you specify exactly what kind of training and mentorship the person would receive in response? Okay. Oh, there's a really great question here from, it's cut off, but James Romero, I'm sorry, the rest of your name isn't showing up. But how uniform are benefits for postdocs across the different institutions, in particular, since you had some from biotech companies? I think it's extremely important to compare across institutes. And what we do on our website, we haven't done it during COVID for a few reasons, but we regularly update a spreadsheet for the benefits across institutes in the Boston region. And we found that to be incredibly helpful for advocacy because once one institute adjusts their benefits, it's visible to postdocs at other institutes to say, hey, we are not getting childcare subsidies, but everyone else is, or hey, our salary is lower, or why are we the only group of postdocs that's not getting benefit X? So we maintain that as a public database on our website. So you can go to bostonpostdocs.org and find it there. And I think that other regions should do the same, so we could really see what the differences are between institutes. And I have found that that's actually been helpful at an advocacy level in terms of increasing benefits across institutes. So I'm really glad someone asked that. I would have forgotten to say that otherwise. Right, there's a comment about pay being higher in national lab. I think that's great. Right, since we pay so much more to you. So yeah, Tracy is describing that there's resistance to increasing salary, and I agree that they're right. I think that hopefully a way that we could raise the salary would be addressing it at the levels in which funding is received, stipulating not just training expectations, but also salary expectations of if someone is going to be funded for this grant, there should be a minimum salary at which trainees are paid, and that could be hopefully also enforced at the institutional level to ensure that there aren't postdocs that are getting paid less than a certain minimum or falling through the cracks in some way. So I think that's a very important point.
Yeah, I think that's all the questions we have.
Right. So if anyone has any other questions, let me bring up the contact information. You can also ask me questions in the NPA chat, the lounge function of the software. And like I said, please check out our website. You feel free to send an email about anything. We love to talk to people in different regions. And these are all really important discussions. And I'm really glad that we're able to get the opportunity. Again, we're really grateful to the NPA, but also for everyone that's asking questions and attending. I think it's really important. Thank you, Alan, for the comment. I'm just looking through the chat here because there's tons of things I missed. There's Luann. Hi, Luann. I haven't talked to you in a little bit, but it's Luann is definitely a very active postdoctoral officer in our group, and we're grateful for her. And yeah, so thanks for attending, and I really appreciate all your input and attention, and feel free to get in touch.
Okay, thank you, Jan, for the presentation. Just some important reminders. So the recording will be available next week for a limited time. So there is a trivia happening right now, so please join us for that. And remember to visit the poster and the exhibitors in the Siddhar Sinai Expo Hall All the presenter are usually available on the breaks, and you can ask them the questions. And at the end of today, please try to participate in our signature pub crawl, which is scheduled for 5 to 6. Thank you everyone for coming again.
Thanks.